Snow fell heavily over Duluth, Minnesota, as a tiny 5-year-old girl staggered along the snow-covered railroad tracks, clutching her newborn baby brother wrapped in a faded blue blanket. Her little body trembled, lips cracked, breath shallow. The baby cried weakly in her arms, and then she collapsed onto the icy tracks. From the distance, a train's horn screamed, growing louder, closer, unstoppable. No one saw, no one heard. And then, out of nowhere, a German shepherd bolted into view, barking wildly, snow flying under his paws. Behind him came a battle-worn veteran, his eyes heavy with grief and pain, running breathlessly toward the tracks. Will he make it in time, before the train reaches them? Can these two fragile souls survive this freezing nightmare? If you believe in miracles, comment Amen to send your prayers. And tell us your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story of hope and second chances can reach. The late winter afternoon in Duluth, Minnesota was bitterly cold, the sky gray and heavy with falling snow, and the icy wind cut across the frozen ground like shattered glass. The abandoned railroad tracks stretched endlessly beneath the pale light, vanishing into the distance. A tiny 5-year-old girl stumbled along the tracks, her small body shivering violently beneath the relentless wind. Her name was Lila. Her tangled golden hair stuck to her damp cheeks, and her pale skin was raw from the cold. She wore a thin, torn red dress, its frayed sleeves exposing her frostbitten arms. Her bare feet, purple from freezing, crunched softly against the snow-dusted rails. In her trembling arms, she clutched Noah, her 3-month-old baby brother, wrapped in a faded blue blanket barely thick enough to block the icy air. Noah whimpered softly, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching beneath the thin fabric, his face flushed red from the biting wind. Lila whispered to him, her voice weak and hoarse, "It's okay, little one. Mama will come back. Just a little longer." The words trembled against the silence, swept away by the howling wind. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath leaving a faint cloud in the freezing air. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Dizziness blurred her vision, and her steps slowed until her legs finally gave way. She collapsed onto the frozen steel rail, arms tightening instinctively around Noah, as if shielding him from the cold and the world itself. Noah cried softly, the faint sound quickly swallowed by the roaring wind. And then it came. Faint at first, but growing louder, the deep, mournful horn of a freight train, cutting through the frozen silence like a scream from the earth itself. The steel rails beneath Lila's body began to hum and vibrate under the distant weight of the oncoming giant. No one saw them. No one heard them. The streets nearby were silent. Houses shuddered against the storm, windows glowing faintly as families gathered around warmth and safety. No one, except Shadow. Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd, suddenly froze mid-step along the snow-packed trail by the river. His amber eyes widened, his pointed ears twitching sharply as his powerful black nose picked up something faint, the subtle mix of sour milk, cold sweat, and blood. Shadow was large, muscular, and graceful, his black and tan coat thick against the winter chill. A small notch marked his left ear, a scar from an old accident, but it only added to his rugged presence. At 5 years old, Shadow's senses were razor sharp, his instincts trained to act without hesitation. In a single motion, Shadow dropped low and bolted forward, his powerful legs tearing through the deep snow, kicking up a spray of icy crystals behind him. A sharp, urgent bark ripped from his chest, cutting through the freezing air like a flare. Ethan Walker, 46 years old, stumbled as the leash ripped free from his glove. "Shadow, heel!" he barked, his breath exploding in clouds of steam. But the dog didn't slow. Ethan cursed and broke into a run, boots slipping on the icy ground as he fought to keep up. Ethan was broad-shouldered, his once powerful frame still sturdy from years of warehouse work, though age and grief weighed heavily on him. His steel-gray hair peeked out beneath his worn wool cap, and a short salt and pepper beard framed his angular jaw. His green-gray eyes, sharp yet weary, carried storms of untold stories, memories from Iraq, where he had fought and survived, only to bring the war home inside his mind. PTSD clung to him like a shadow, the ghosts of sand-filled streets and lost comrades haunting him each night. After the war, poverty arrived, followed by Amanda leaving him when she could no longer endure his silence. But the deepest wound was Emma, his 6-year-old daughter, whose battle with leukemia ended in a hospital room too quiet for someone so small. Now, Ethan existed quietly, surviving one day at a time, with Shadow as his closest companion, the only steady heartbeat that tethered him to life. But now, Shadow was running like the world was ending. Ethan forced his body to move faster, his boots crunching into the snow, lungs burning as the icy air sliced through him. And then, he heard it. A faint, fragile sound carried on the wind, a baby's cry. Shadow's frantic barking grew sharper ahead, guiding Ethan toward the tracks. His chest tightened as he rounded the bend, and then his heart stopped. Up ahead, sprawled across the snow-dusted rails, lay a small girl in a torn red dress, her tangled golden hair plastered against her pale cheeks, arms wrapped tightly around a tiny blue bundle. The fading light caught the slight rise and fall of her chest, but barely. Ethan's mind narrowed into a single blinding moment of clarity. The freight's headlights appeared in the distance, slicing through the falling snow like twin blades of light, the horn screaming again, louder, closer, relentless. Shadow barked wildly, circling the children, tail stiff, ears pinned, snow sprang beneath his paws. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts, his legs pumping, boots slipping, lungs searing as he tore through the drifts toward the tracks. The rails shook beneath his feet now. The sound of the train roared louder, an unstoppable wall of steel thundering toward the fragile, motionless figures ahead. Shadow sprinted ahead, barking furiously. Ethan chased behind, every muscle straining, his heart hammering against his ribs, each breath ragged and uneven. And then, the train's horn blasted violently, echoing like thunder across the frozen landscape, the lights flooding the tracks in a blinding white glare. Would they reach the children in time? Shadow lunged forward with everything he had. Ethan ran harder, faster, the icy wind slicing his face as the roaring steel closed in. To be continued. The train's horn screamed across the frozen air, and Ethan's boots pounded against the snow-slick ground as Shadow darted ahead, barking wildly, his black and tan body cutting through the blur of white. The rails trembled beneath Ethan's feet, his heart racing as the blinding freight lights carved open the darkness. In one swift motion, he slid his arm beneath the small girl's frail body and cradled the blue-swaddled baby tight against his chest, scooping both into his arms with a grunt. He didn't think. He didn't breathe. There was only weight and motion and the animal roar behind him. Shadow pressed close to his leg, guiding him along the embankment as Ethan's boots fought for purchase on the icy ballast. He climbed, every muscle burning, every breath tearing like glass inside his chest, and then his body surged free of the rails just as the train's monstrous wind slammed into him, rattling his bones as steel thundered by behind them. He dropped to his knees in the snow, clutching both children tight against him, his lungs pulling in ragged, icy gulps of air, while Shadow stood braced against his side, hackles raised, breath steaming white into the night. For several long seconds, Ethan could hear nothing but his own pulse and the fading thunder of the freight, the stillness afterward so sharp it hummed. He glanced down at the little girl, her tangled golden hair damp with frost, strands stuck to her pale cheek where tiny ice crystals had formed, and at the tiny baby whose faint cries barely made it past the folds of the thin blanket. He pulled them closer, sheltering them against his chest, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The cold was cutting deeper by the second, and he knew if they stayed any longer, it would claim them all. Adjusting his grip carefully, he pushed himself to his feet and began the long, steady walk back to his house, Shadow pacing tightly beside him, ears pinned and tail rigid, every muscle coiled and ready. By the time Ethan reached his small home at the edge of Duluth, his shoulders ached from holding the children, his legs trembled with fatigue, and his breath came in harsh clouds beneath the flickering porch light. His house was modest, a single-story structure with chipped blue paint and a sagging roof where snow clung stubbornly against the eaves, but tonight it stood like a promise of warmth against the frozen dark. He nudged the door open with his shoulder, stepping inside and letting the faint heat of the old electric heater seep into his numb skin. The living room was small, simple, but tidy. A second-hand couch pushed against the wall, shelves lined with dog-eared paperbacks, scuffed wooden floors, and picture frames that hadn't been touched in years. He laid the little girl carefully on the couch, Noah still nestled against his chest, his cries soft and fading into tiny hiccups. Ethan hurried to the old heater, twisting the knobs until the orange coils glowed brighter, filling the room with its faint hum and warmth. His hands shook as he searched the kitchen cabinets until they closed around a small tin pushed to the back of the shelf, a half-used canister of formula he had never been able to throw away. For a moment, his breath caught as his fingers lingered there, memory flashing uninvited. Emma's small hands clutching at his shirt, her bright laugh echoing against these same walls, and then the cold silence of the hospital room that had stolen her from him 2 winters ago. He blinked hard and set the memory aside, dragging himself back to the present, because now another child, another tiny life, was crying softly in his arms. He boiled water on the stove, mixing the powder carefully and testing it on his wrist the way he used to, his movements automatic, muscle memory rising from some part of himself he thought he'd buried. When he returned to the couch, Lila had stirred slightly, blinking up at him through lashes heavy with exhaustion, her wide blue eyes glassy and distant, cheeks pale as melting snow. She instinctively clutched Noah tighter when Ethan knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly, keeping his voice steady despite the ache tightening his throat. For a long moment, the girl simply stared at him, unblinking, lips cracked and trembling. Then she whispered hoarsely, "Mama, we'll come back, right?" Ethan swallowed hard, forcing the sharp knot in his chest down, where it couldn't break through his voice. "Right now, sweetheart, you need to rest," he murmured gently, tucking the bottle between Noah's small lips, holding him carefully as the baby latched with soft, greedy gulps. The sound of Noah drinking eased something tight inside Ethan, but in its place came the ache of memory, deep and sharp, and he found himself brushing his thumb lightly against the baby's cheek, as though it were his own daughter he was holding again. Shadow padded over and lowered himself against the couch, his amber eyes following every small movement, his warm nose nudging against Lila's limp hand. The little girl's fingers curled instinctively into his thick fur, and her tense shoulders softened just slightly, as though something in the shepherd's quiet strength helped anchor her in the moment. After Noah finished feeding, Ethan settled him into a blanket nest beside his sister, pulling another patch throw over them both before reaching for the old cordless phone on the side table. His stiff fingers hesitated only briefly before dialing a number he hadn't used in months. "Grace Miller," came the steady voice on the other end, warm but alert, the kind of tone belonging to someone who had spent years handling fragile situations. Grace, 38, slender and sharp-eyed, carried herself with calm authority. Her light brown hair was usually pulled back into a messy bun during long workdays, while her hazel eyes, large and almond-shaped, always reflected empathy before judgment. Raised in Duluth by a single mother who worked double shifts, Grace had grown into a woman who wore practicality like armor, but never lost her quiet compassion, making her one of the most trusted social workers in the county. "Grace, it's Ethan," he said, his voice lower than usual, roughened by exhaustion and cold. A brief pause, then a shift in her tone. "Ethan, what happened?" "I found 2 kids," he said, glancing at the couch where Noah stirred faintly beneath the blanket, his tiny fists curled against his chest, and where Lila lay curled protectively around him. "A baby and his sister, on the tracks. If Shadow hadn't found them—" He trailed off, letting the silence finish what words couldn't. Grace drew in a slow breath. "Are they safe now?" "They're warming up," Ethan replied, rubbing a hand over his face. "Baby's drinking formula. The girl's awake, but she's freezing. I don't know how long they were out there." Grace cursed softly under her breath before steadying her voice. "I'd come right now if I could, Ethan, but the highways are shut down. We've got whiteout conditions north and west, and the plows won't clear your road until morning." Ethan stared at the window, watching the snow swirl violently beneath the dim streetlight outside. "So I keep them here tonight," he said flatly, more to himself than her. "Exactly. Keep them warm. Check their fingers and toes every half hour. If the baby gets quiet and limp, wake him. You have to keep him active. And if the girl stops shivering before she warms up, that's hypothermia. Get her against your chest, skin to skin if needed. I'll get there as soon as the roads are open." Ethan nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see him. All right. Ethan, Grace added gently, her voice softening. They're lucky you found them. He didn't answer that, because luck didn't feel like the right word. When the call ended, he set the phone down and sat heavily in the armchair across from the couch, leaning forward, elbows braced against his knees, his green-gray eyes fixed on the two tiny forms beneath the blankets. Lila's hand still rested on Shadow's thick neck, while Noah's faint breaths rose and fell unevenly against the thin patchwork quilt. Outside, the wind howled and clawed against the thin windows, shaking them in their frames. Inside, the room hummed with quiet warmth, but Ethan felt the weight of the silence pressing on his ribs. He watched the children sleep, his thoughts spiraling back into corners he had long avoided. Emma's laugh, the soft warmth of her hair. The last time he held her before the hospital went quiet. His chest ached with the memory, and yet, holding these children tonight, the silence didn't feel quite the same anymore. Still, questions gnawed at him. Who were they? Why were they alone? Where was their mother? And why, of all places, had a 5-year-old ended up on the frozen tracks with a newborn in her arms? Shadow shifted slightly, resting his chin on the couch near Lila's hand, as though anchoring them all in this fragile, temporary safety. Ethan sat back, rubbing his cold, tired eyes with the heel of his hand, the low hum of the heater filling the silence as he whispered into the dimness, "Why would a little girl be out there?" The storm howled in answer, carrying no secrets. Inside the small house, Ethan sat awake long into the night, listening to the uneven breaths of the two tiny strangers sleeping beneath his roof, while Shadow kept silent watch at their side, and outside, the snow kept falling endlessly over Duluth. The storm finally broke by dawn, leaving Duluth blanketed in a deep, silent layer of snow that glittered faintly beneath a pale winter sun. Ethan Walker stood by the frost-coated window, his green-gray eyes tracing the quiet street outside as his fingers tapped restlessly against the chipped windowsill. Behind him, the small living room carried the fragile warmth of the old electric heater, its orange coils glowing faintly while a kettle whistled softly on the counter. Lila was curled on the couch under a patched quilt, her golden hair messy and tangled, her small arms wrapped tightly around Noah, who was still swaddled in his faded blue blanket. Shadow lay stretched out near them, his black and tan fur brushing against the edge of the blanket, his amber eyes half closed but ears twitching every time the house creaked against the cold. Ethan's thoughts churned quietly, circling questions that refused to settle. He had been up most of the night, rising every hour to check Noah's tiny breaths, adjusting the heater, and watching Lila as she slept with a tension that never fully released from her small shoulders, even in dreams. Something about her silence gnawed at him, something that went beyond exhaustion and cold. He turned back, leaning his forearm against the doorframe, as his gaze settled on the faint bruises along Lila's thin forearms, visible now in the soft morning light. Old marks, yellowed at the edges. He crouched beside the couch and spoke gently. "Lila, does this hurt?" His voice carried the patience he rarely gave himself. Lila stirred, blinking at him with cautious blue eyes before shaking her head. "It's old," she whispered softly, her voice hoarse and small, barely more than a breath. Her tiny fingers tightened on Noah's blanket, as if afraid he might be taken from her. Ethan hesitated, torn between pressing further and giving her time. He leaned back on his heels and rested a hand lightly on Shadow's shoulder, grounding himself in the steady warmth of the dog's presence. "You're safe here," Ethan said softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you or your brother." For a long time, Lila said nothing, her gaze shifting between Ethan and Shadow. Then, slowly, her lips parted. "Mama always said that too," she murmured, almost to herself, before adding in a trembling whisper, "But Mama's gone." Ethan's chest tightened. He stayed silent, letting the quiet stretch until Lila's small voice filled it again. "Daddy's gone too. He had an accident at the factory. The big machines." Her breathing hitched, and she rubbed the back of her hand against her nose in a nervous gesture. Then, Mama and Rick started yelling, really loud. Mama cried a lot. Then, one night, she left. Ethan frowned at the name. "Rick?" Lila nodded faintly, her tangled hair falling across her face as she whispered, "Mama's Husband. He's not my real daddy. She hesitated, eyes lowering to Noah's tiny face, her voice even smaller now. I don't like him. Ethan's jaw tightened, his thoughts running faster now. He didn't press her for more. Children often carried fragments, not full stories. He simply tucked the quilt closer around her and stood, pacing slowly as Shadow's ears pricked at his sharp, thoughtful breathing. The sound of soft scratching pulled his attention. Shadow had wandered toward the corner, where Lila's small canvas bag sat near the armchair, the one she had clutched desperately before falling asleep the night before. The shepherd nosed at it insistently, pawing lightly until the bag tipped forward and a few scattered items spilled onto the floor. A small faded scarf, a chipped wooden toy, and a folded piece of crumpled paper. Ethan crouched quickly, plucking it from the floor before Shadow could paw at it further. Unfolding the paper carefully, Ethan frowned. It wasn't a child's drawing or a note from school. It was an address, scribbled hastily in pen. 47 Alder Creek Road. The name of the street scratched a familiar itch in his memory. Somewhere on the outskirts of Duluth, half forgotten among the old industrial neighborhoods near the edge of the forest reserve. He turned the paper over in his hands before glancing back at Lila. Lila, do you know what this is? She shook her head slowly, her wide eyes confused and weary. Mama put it in my bag before she went away. That single sentence sat heavy in Ethan's chest. It didn't sound like someone abandoning her children. It sounded like someone leaving a trail. He studied the address again, feeling the low, restless hum of questions swell louder inside him. Who lived there? Why had Harper hidden it? And why leave it with Lila at all? The name surfaced from Lila's quiet words like a cold weight. Harper. Lila's mother. Ethan pictured a woman he had never met, but already sensed through absence. 28 years old, leaving small clues where no one else might notice. Shadow moved to his side, tail flicking once as if sensing Ethan's unease. The dog's keen amber eyes locked briefly on the folded paper, his ears twitching sharply before his gaze returned to Ethan's face, expectant. Ethan set the paper on the table, staring at it in silence for a long moment. He didn't know much yet, but something deep in his gut, the same instinct that had carried him through Iraq's ruined streets, that had taught him when to move and when to wait, whispered that Harper hadn't simply abandoned her children. Something else had happened. Something darker, something hidden beneath snow and silence. He heard a faint noise behind him and turned to see Lila watching him carefully, her small arms tightening protectively around Noah. He softened his voice. Lila, he said quietly, we're going to figure this out, I promise. She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on Shadow, and when the shepherd lowered his head and rested his muzzle gently against her hand, she finally nodded, a small, fragile motion that spoke louder than words. Ethan leaned back against the counter, his jaw tightening around the questions he couldn't yet answer, his thumb tapping absently against the folded scrap of paper. Outside, the sun glinted faintly off the blanket of snow, but inside the little house, the air felt heavier, thick with unspoken truths waiting to surface. The mystery was no longer just about survival. It had a name now, Harper. And Ethan knew, deep down, that finding her was the only way to understand why a 5-year-old girl had ended up on frozen tracks with a newborn in her arms. The morning air over Duluth was razor sharp, a pale sun barely lifting above the snow-capped horizon, while the wind whispered low across the quiet street. Ethan Walker stood by the worn wooden table, his green-gray eyes locked on the folded scrap of paper, the address scribbled in Harper's hurried hand. 47 Alder Creek Road. The storm had passed, but the unease in his chest hadn't. He glanced at Lila, who sat quietly on the couch, hugging Noah close against her small chest, her golden hair tangled from sleep, her wide blue eyes fixed on Shadow lying near her feet. The German shepherd's ears twitched, his amber gaze following Ethan's every move as if he, too, understood that today would not be simple. Ethan crouched by Lila, resting a hand gently on the quilt. "We're going to take a drive," he said softly, his voice steady but low. "We'll keep Noah warm, and Shadow's coming with us. It's just to check something, okay?" Lila hesitated, her small fingers tightening around Noah's blanket before nodding faintly, though her gaze never left Shadow, as if trusting him more than anyone else. The old pickup truck coughed to life outside, engine grumbling as Ethan scraped frost from the windshield. Snow cracked beneath his boots, the morning silence broken only by Shadow's paws padding against the icy driveway. He bundled Lila and Noah into the back seat, securing Noah carefully in a makeshift carrier padded with Ethan's old army jacket, while Shadow leapt into the passenger seat, his tail brushing lightly against the dashboard. As Ethan slid behind the wheel, his grip tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He hadn't driven north toward Lake Superior in years, not since before Emma died, but today the path ahead was no longer his choice. It was Harper's. The road to Alder Creek wound through narrow lanes carved between walls of frozen pine. The forest pressed close on either side, silent except for the muted growl of the truck's engine, the tires crunching steadily over the icy path. Lila leaned against the window, watching the frost patterns swirl across the glass, while Shadow sat rigid, his amber eyes scanning the tree line like a sentry. As they climbed higher toward the ridge, the lake came into view, its vast expanse frozen solid beneath a dim wash of light, the horizon stretching flat and endless. Finally, Ethan slowed the truck as the address came into sight. A small cabin sat at the edge of the woods, its faded siding peeling from years of neglect. The roof sagged slightly beneath the weight of snow, and the windows were dark, the glass half fogged with frost. Around it, the clearing stretched silent, except for faint depressions scattered across the snow where footprints had been partially erased by the storm. Ethan's sharp eyes tracked them carefully, multiple sets, most old, but a few fresher than the rest. He killed the engine, the low rumble fading into the stillness as the cold settled around them. Turning to Lila, he gave a reassuring nod. "Stay close to me," he said softly. She clutched Noah tighter, but nodded, pressing her cheek briefly into the baby's hair before sliding from the truck. Shadow jumped down after Ethan, his breath steaming in the frigid air, the fur along his spine bristling as he lowered his head, sniffing the snow. The door to the cabin creaked under Ethan's hand, opening into a dark, musty space. The air inside carried a faint mix of damp wood and old smoke, heavy with the weight of abandonment. A single chair lay toppled near the corner, and the cracked table bore the faint stains of something spilled long ago. Dust drifted in thin shafts of pale light from a broken window pane, settling across the warped floorboards like quiet secrets. Ethan stepped carefully, scanning each shadow, while Shadow padded forward silently, nose to the ground, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. Lila hovered near the doorway, rocking Noah gently, her wide blue eyes darting nervously around the empty room. On a low shelf near the far wall, Ethan spotted something half buried beneath a scattering of old papers. A small jacket, frayed at the edges, its faded green fabric familiar from the photos he had glimpsed earlier in Lila's bag. He lifted it gently, fingers brushing the worn seams, and felt his chest tighten. It was Harper's. Beside the jacket lay a torn scrap of paper. The handwriting was hurried, shaky, smudged where moisture had blurred the ink, but the words were painfully clear. "If anyone finds this, please save the children." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand trembling slightly as he set the note down on the dusty table. That one line carved deeper than any answer Lila could have given him. Harper hadn't abandoned her children. She had been forced to leave them behind. Before he could speak, Shadow growled low, ears snapping forward as he prowled toward the back door. Ethan followed the shepherd's line of sight to the snowy clearing beyond, where faint tracks cut across the edge of the cabin's shadow and disappeared into the forest beyond. He crouched low near the threshold, brushing snow from the prints with his glove. These were no ordinary footprints. The impressions were deep, far deeper than his own. Broad boots, heavy-set stride, an adult male carrying significant weight. The edges were sharp enough to know they were fresh, but enough flakes had settled that he guessed they were laid sometime during the night. "Ethan!" Lila's small voice trembled behind him. "What is it?" He glanced back at her, his voice low and measured. "Tracks," he said simply, his green-gray eyes scanning the tree line. Shadow nosed the air, his breath pluming as he caught the faintest trace of something unfamiliar. Ethan's pulse quickened as he rose slowly, following the shepherd's gaze into the pines. For years, Ethan had relied on instinct more than words. Instinct sharpened by war, honed by nights where silence had meant survival. And right now, every nerve in his body told him one thing. Harper wasn't hiding from her children. Harper was running from something, or someone, and whatever had driven her here was close enough to leave fresh marks in the snow. He reached down, rubbing Shadow's ear gently, grounding them both as the shepherd leaned forward on his front paws, waiting for a command. "Not yet, buddy," Ethan whispered under his breath, forcing himself to stand still as he weighed his choices. Behind him, Lila rocked Noah slowly, unaware that the tracks outside told a story none of them were ready to hear. He straightened, pulling his coat tighter against the biting cold, his gaze fixed on the dark path disappearing into the trees. Harper was out there somewhere, leaving scraps of hope behind, while something followed her through the snow. And now, holding her note in his hand and two terrified children in his care, Ethan knew the truth as clearly as the frozen breath hanging between them. This wasn't over, and whoever had left those tracks would not stop until they found what they were looking for. The wind over Duluth carried a strange weight in the days that followed, a quiet tension that settled over Ethan's small house like frost creeping across a window pane. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the streets lined with uneven white drifts, but the silence outside no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. Ethan Walker stood by the living room window, his green-gray eyes narrowed as he adjusted the old blinds just enough to see the street below. Parked across from his home, angled slightly toward the yard, was a black pickup truck he had never seen before. No plates on the front, its windshield coated in frost that concealed whoever sat behind it. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but the truck came back again the next morning, and the next. Always in the same spot, always silent. Inside the house, Shadow paced near the door, the German shepherd's black and tan fur bristling every time the truck appeared. The 5-year-old dog had grown restless, ears twitching constantly, his amber eyes locked on the street with unblinking focus. At night, Shadow's unease only sharpened. He growled low, sometimes barking suddenly at nothing Ethan could see, his hackles rising like a storm rolling beneath his skin. Ethan tried to calm him, crouching beside him, running his gloved fingers along the shepherd's tense shoulders, but Shadow stayed alert, chest rumbling with restrained sound. On the third night, Ethan stepped out onto the porch, breath misting in the icy air, and scanned the street. The truck was gone this time, but something else set his instincts burning. He crouched near the railing, brushing his fingers across the thin layer of snow that had settled since evening, and saw fresh tracks leading toward the yard. Heavy boots, wide-set strides, deep impressions. Not Lila's, not the delivery driver's, not his own. He felt his jaw tighten as Shadow pressed against his leg, ears pinned, gaze locked on the street beyond the shadows. Inside, the tension hung heavy in the small house. Lila sat cross-legged on the couch, clutching Noah tightly, her wide blue eyes following Shadow's restless pacing. She had grown quieter since their trip to the cabin, as though some small part of her already understood what Ethan refused to say aloud. Someone was looking for them. Later that night, Ethan rummaged through a storage box beneath the stairs and found his old motion sensor security camera, dusty and scratched, but still functional. He mounted it above the porch and wired the receiver to the small monitor in the kitchen. The image it displayed was grainy and green-tinted, but it would be enough to see if anyone approached. The following evening, the pickup returned. Its headlights flickered once, then cut off. Ethan sat silently at the kitchen table, Shadow at his feet, both of them listening to the wind scrape against the glass. Hours passed, the house silent except for the faint hum of the heater and Noah's uneven breathing from the couch. At midnight, Shadow stiffened suddenly, his amber gaze snapping toward the front door as his body went rigid, tail low and straight, ears sharp. Ethan rose without a sound and crossed to the monitor. The grainy image showed it instantly, a man standing motionless in the falling snow just beyond the driveway, half shrouded in shadows beneath the dim street lamp. Tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone accustomed to carrying weight, he wore a dark parka, hood pulled low so his face was lost in shadow. He didn't move. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, still as the frost building along the mailbox, watching the house. For nearly 2 hours, the man didn't leave. He stood perfectly motionless, as if carved from ice, while Ethan sat in silence, heart pounding steadily beneath his ribs. Shadow pressed against his leg like a living alarm. Eventually, the stranger turned slowly, the movement deliberate, and walked back toward the truck. The taillights flared briefly before the vehicle disappeared down the street, swallowed by the dark. The next morning, Ethan called Grace. She picked up on the second ring, Her voice clipped and brisk, but her tone softened when she heard his quiet words. "Someone's watching us." Grace Miller, the 38-year-old social worker with hazel eyes that always seemed to see more than she said, listened without interruption as Ethan described the black pickup, the silent man, and the tracks in the snow. When he finished, she exhaled sharply, muttering something under her breath before speaking louder. "Ethan, there's something I haven't told you yet." Ethan frowned, leaning against the counter, his knuckles tightening around the receiver. "Now's the time." Grace hesitated, her voice lowering. "Before Harper disappeared, she reached out to me once. She was worried about someone watching the house. When I pressed her, she admitted that a company called Whitmore Labs had been contacting her." The name hit Ethan like cold water. "Whitmore Labs," he repeated slowly, tasting the weight of it. Grace nodded audibly over the line. "It's a pharmaceutical research facility based near St. Paul. Big, private, well-funded, and they've had controversies before. There were whispers about unapproved trials, children used in immune response studies. Nothing proven, but enough for lawsuits and settlements to vanish quietly." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, jaw clenching as fragments began to assemble into a darker picture. And Harper, she was connected to them? "Not officially," Grace clarified, "but I dug through old files last night after you mentioned the cabin. 2 years ago, Whitmore Labs offered Harper a contract, a study on pediatric immune anomalies, according to their phrasing. She refused. A few months later, Rick came into the picture, and then the argument started." Ethan's hand tightened around the folded note he still carried in his jacket pocket, Harper's plea etched into its crumpled fibers. "Please, save the children." The thought settled cold into his bones. Harper hadn't vanished because she wanted to. She had vanished because someone wanted something from her, and from Lila and Noah. Shadow gave a low growl near the door, pulling Ethan back to the present. He stepped over and opened the blinds slightly, scanning the street. The black truck wasn't there, but absence wasn't comfort anymore. It only meant the waiting had shifted elsewhere. "Grace," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady, "if Whitmore's involved, this isn't just about Harper." "No," Grace agreed softly. "It's about the kids, and whatever Whitmore Labs wanted from them, they weren't going to ask twice." The room fell silent as Ethan set the phone back into its cradle. Shadow rested his head against Ethan's knee, amber eyes unblinking, ears twitching to every faint sound beyond the thin walls of the house. Lila stirred faintly on the couch, hugging Noah tighter in her sleep, as though even her dreams carried the weight of something hunting them. Ethan stood there, staring at the quiet street through the frost-coated glass, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air, the folded note still pressed into his palm. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but each one cut deeper. Harper, Whitmore Labs, the silent watcher in the snow, and 2 fragile children at the center of it all. And somewhere out there, he knew, the man beneath the street lamp would return. The storm rolled in fast over Duluth, swallowing the neighborhood beneath waves of snow and howling wind. By nightfall, Ethan Walker's small house stood buried beneath drifts that pressed against the windows, the glass trembling under the force of the blizzard. The heater hummed faintly in the corner, fighting against the cold creeping through every crack in the old walls. Shadow lay near the door, his thick black and tan fur dusted with frost from his earlier patrol outside, his amber eyes half-lidded but sharp, ears twitching with every groan of the house against the wind. Lila sat curled on the couch, hugging Noah close, the baby swaddled tightly in his faded blue blanket. The storm outside should have made them safer, hiding them beneath the fury of nature. But Ethan's gut told him otherwise. He sat at the kitchen table, green-gray eyes fixed on the grainy monitor of the old porch camera. The screen flickered occasionally, the storm interfering with its signal, but the sight beyond the porch remained still, a blanket of white darkness and swirling snowflakes. For days, the black truck hadn't returned, but silence didn't feel like safety anymore. Ethan had learned long ago, in places where silence meant ambush, that danger was often patient. Shadow's low growl broke the quiet first. His head lifted sharply, ears pinned forward, amber gaze locking on the door. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening as he reached for the pistol holstered beneath his jacket, an old .45 he hadn't touched in years, cleaned twice this week. He crouched low, moving silently toward the window near the door, and peered into the storm-swept night. Two figures moved against the white, blurred silhouettes gliding through the storm, dark clothing melting into shadows beneath the swirling snow. They were careful, too careful. One crouched briefly near the side of the house, the other circling toward the back porch, their boots crunching softly against the ice-crusted ground. Ethan's jaw tightened. He lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Lila," he said, glancing at the couch. "Take Noah. Get into the back room. Lock the door. Stay quiet." The little girl's blue eyes widened, but she nodded without a word, clutching Noah and disappearing quickly into the hallway, her small frame vanishing into the safety of the rear bedroom. The front lock rattled suddenly, then stopped. A faint creak followed, the sound of weight shifting against the porch boards. Ethan steadied his breath, body instinctively falling into the muscle memory carved from his years in Iraq. He raised his pistol slightly, stepping back into the corner of the kitchen where the shadows concealed him, letting the door become the trap it was about to be. Then it burst open. The first intruder lunged through, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black parka and a balaclava that hid everything but cold gray eyes. He carried a suppressed pistol, moving low, practiced, trained. Shadow reacted instantly. The German Shepherd exploded from his place by the door, his 85-pound frame colliding with the man's side, as his deep guttural snarl cut through the roar of the storm outside. The intruder went down hard, gun clattering against the hardwood floor as Shadow's powerful jaws clamped against his forearm. The man shouted, his voice muffled by the mask, struggling to wrench free, but Shadow held with lethal precision, ears pinned flat, teeth buried deep. The second figure appeared in the doorway, slightly shorter, leaner, but quicker. He dove sideways, aiming at Ethan with a short-barreled revolver. Ethan rolled to the left, dropping behind the kitchen table as the shot split the air, splinters of wood scattering across the linoleum. His training kicked in before thought could form. He slid into position, braced his elbow, and fired once. The bullet struck low, grazing the man's thigh and spinning him back against the door frame. The first intruder finally kicked free of Shadow, slamming a boot into the shepherd's ribs. Shadow yelped sharply but lunged again, claws tearing against the hardwood as he forced the man back toward the wall. Ethan surged forward, grabbing the man's wrist before he could reach for the fallen gun, twisting sharply until the intruder dropped with a grunt of pain. A quick sweep of Ethan's knee knocked him off balance, and the man hit the floor with a dull thud, Shadow pinning his shoulder with his full weight, growls rumbling deep in his chest. The second man limped backward toward the storm outside, blood staining his dark cargo pants, his breath ragged against the icy air. Ethan aimed, but the man dove off the porch into the whiteout before he could fire, his figure swallowed instantly by the blizzard. Inside, silence returned, ragged, heavy, broken only by Shadow's panting and the whistle of wind against the windows. Ethan kept his pistol raised as he approached the man pinned beneath Shadow, yanking the balaclava from his head. The intruder was in his late 30s, pale skin slicked with sweat, short brown hair dampened by melted snow. His jawline was sharp, stubbled beneath a thin layer of frost, and his blue-gray eyes burned with restrained fury rather than fear. Ethan pressed a knee into the man's chest, voice steady and low. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing, jaw clenched tight, breath hissing between gritted teeth. Ethan reached down, rifling quickly through his coat pocket, and froze when his fingers brushed a hard plastic edge. He pulled it free, his eyes narrowing as he read the words etched into the smooth white surface. Whitmore Laboratories, Field Operations. Below the logo was a name he didn't recognize, but what stopped him wasn't the ID. It was the small photograph clipped beneath it. Harper, her auburn hair framed her pale face, wide green eyes glassy and swollen, as though the image had been taken under duress, and stamped in bold black letters across the bottom, Subject #17. Ethan stared at the photo, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. Harper wasn't just missing, she was targeted, and whatever Whitmore Labs had started with her hadn't ended when she disappeared. He turned the ID over, scanning the back quickly. A series of numbers, cryptic and precise, were printed beneath the barcode, patient identifiers, dates, trial codes, and one line circled hastily in red ink. Noah, genomic sample required. Ethan's stomach dropped. It wasn't Harper they were hunting. It was Noah. Shadow's deep growl rumbled beneath his palm. The shepherd's amber gaze locked firmly on the unconscious intruder. Behind them, Lila peeked around the edge of the hallway door, clutching Noah tight against her chest, her blue eyes wide and wet but silent, her breath shaky against the fabric of the baby's blanket. Ethan met her gaze briefly, softening his tone. "It's okay. You're safe." But inside, he knew it was far from the truth. He bound the intruder's hands with an old length of paracord, dragging him toward the chair near the front door. The man's breathing slowed as unconsciousness finally took him. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, listening to the storm battering the windows and the heater humming faintly in the corner, before shifting his gaze toward the ID card on the table. Whitmore Labs hadn't given up. They had found them. And the black pickup truck outside had been only the beginning. Ethan leaned against the counter, pressing a hand against his forehead, his breath rough and shallow as fragments of the past 3 days collided violently in his mind. The cabin, the note, the strange footprints, the silent watcher beneath the street lamp, and now, Whitmore Labs directly at his door. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the old glass panes as snow slammed against the frame. Shadow stood close at his side, ears twitching, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his warm fur pressed lightly against Ethan's leg like an anchor. Ethan rested a hand on the shepherd's back and whispered under his breath, his voice cold and certain, "They won't take him." The morning after the storm, Duluth lay silent beneath a thick crust of snow, the streets washed pale beneath a dim, fragile sunlight. Ethan Walker sat at the kitchen table, his elbows resting heavily on the scratched wood, the ID card from Whitmore Labs turning slowly between his fingers. The words, "Subject #17, glared up at him like a wound he couldn't look away from. Across the room, Shadow lay stretched near the heater, his black and tan coat still damp from the snow he had tracked in earlier, amber eyes half closed but alert, ears twitching with every shift of the house's creaking frame. Lila sat curled on the couch, rocking Noah gently against her chest, her tangled golden hair falling across her pale cheeks. She hadn't spoken much since the break-in the night before, but her small fingers never let go of the baby's blanket, clutching it tightly like an anchor. Every once in a while, her blue eyes drifted to Ethan, searching him quietly for answers he wasn't ready to give. The silence broke when the front door opened, letting in a rush of cold air and the faint crunch of boots on the porch. Grace Miller stepped inside, shaking snow from her long beige coat, her hazel eyes sharp and scanning the room, as though expecting another attack. Her light brown hair was pulled into a messy bun beneath a knitted gray beanie, and despite the exhaustion etched into her features, there was a steadiness to the way she moved, practiced, precise, controlled. "I came as soon as I could," she said, her breath clouding faintly as she closed the door behind her. The roads finally cleared, but Ethan, her gaze dropped to the restrained man still unconscious in the corner, his wrists bound with paracord. "I saw the porch camera feed before it went dark. They're escalating." Ethan nodded grimly, sliding the ID card across the table toward her. Grace picked it up, scanned it quickly, and froze when she saw the clipped photo of Harper and the bold stamp beneath it. Her jaw tightened. "I was afraid of this," she murmured, setting the card down carefully. Whitmore Labs has been after her for months. She didn't want to sign their contract. She refused the money, refused the tests. But something changed. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and tense. Changed how? Grace hesitated, pulling a folded manila envelope from inside her coat and placing it on the table. "I spent the last 2 nights digging through old case files. I shouldn't even have these, Ethan. They're sealed." She unfolded the contents carefully, spreading several documents across the table, pages stamped with "confidential," clinical data tables, and Harper's signature at the bottom of one form. Ethan stared at the paper, his brows furrowing deeply. "She signed," he said quietly, disbelief shadowing his words. "Yes," Grace said, her tone grim. At first she agreed. The program was called Project Helix. They were developing a new immunotherapy targeting rare genetic anomalies in children. Harper thought she was helping. But when the tests revealed something about Noah, something Whitmore wasn't supposed to find, she ran. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "What about Noah?" Grace pulled another page forward, her hazel eyes meeting his steadily. According to these, she said softly, tapping the highlighted lines on the form, Noah carries a unique genetic marker, a rare gene linked to an unusually adaptive immune response. It's the kind of discovery pharmaceutical companies would spend billions chasing. Ethan's chest rose and fell slowly, controlled but heavy, the muscles along his jaw tight beneath his salt and pepper beard. And Harper figured it out. Grace nodded. Before she disappeared, Harper left me a voicemail. I never told you because I didn't want to confirm what I suspected until I had proof. She said, they want my son, Grace, not me, him. Lila's soft voice broke the silence, fragile and trembling. They want Noah? She had climbed off the couch, Noah's small body clutched tightly in her arms, her blue eyes wide with fear and brimming with tears. Mama didn't leave us. She was trying to protect him? Grace moved toward her slowly, crouching so their eyes met. That's right, sweetheart, she said gently, brushing a strand of tangled hair from Lila's face. Your mom loves you and Noah. She didn't abandon you. But Lila shook her head, tears spilling freely now, small shoulders trembling as she clung to Noah and turned toward Shadow, burying her face into the shepherd's thick fur. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing his warm body against her side, his steady breathing grounding her fragile sobs. Ethan looked at Grace, his voice quiet but laced with steel. Where is she now? Grace hesitated, drawing a deep breath before sliding a final folder toward him. Inside were satellite photos, security reports, and an address marked in red. 2 days ago, Whitmore moved her, she said softly. They're holding Harper in an underground facility less than 15 miles from here. It's disguised as a storage and distribution hub for medical supplies. No public records, no staff listings. I only found this through an old contact in St. Paul. Ethan flipped through the documents, his green-gray eyes narrowing as he absorbed the grainy images. They're not just keeping her there, he muttered, pointing to a photo showing a gated compound, partially buried beneath layers of snow. They're hiding her. Grace nodded grimly. Ethan, I don't think Harper's a subject anymore. She tapped the words, Project Helix, subject #17, printed in the upper right corner of one report. I think she became leverage. The thoughts settled like lead in the room. Ethan leaned back slowly, his calloused hand resting on the ID card, thumb brushing against Harper's blurred photo. The storm had passed outside, but inside him, something darker gathered. Quiet, sharp, dangerous. Lila's muffled voice broke the silence, her tear-streaked cheeks pressed against Shadow's fur. She's scared, she whispered, rocking slightly as if repeating Harper's fear out loud made it real. She's all alone. Ethan's throat tightened. For a long moment he didn't speak, just stared at the wall as the faint hum of the heater filled the silence between them. He thought of Emma, his daughter, gone too soon, her small hand slipping from his grasp in a cold hospital room. He thought of all the choices he couldn't undo, all the battles he couldn't win. And now, 2 fragile children slept beneath his roof while Whitmore Labs circled like wolves, relentless, patient, waiting. He stood finally, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the room, his steel-gray hair catching the faint orange glow from the heater. He holstered the pistol on his hip, his voice low but steady. I'm not losing them, he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Grace to hear. Not like Emma. Not this time. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching at the weight of Ethan's tone, and padded closer, pressing his side against Ethan's leg like he understood the vow. Grace's hazel eyes held his for a long moment before she nodded slowly. Then we plan, she said simply. But you need to understand, Ethan. Going after them means putting yourself in their sights. They won't hesitate. Ethan's gaze shifted to the sleeping Noah, then to Lila's fragile form leaning against Shadow's warm body. Neither will I. Outside, the late winter wind moaned faintly through the quiet streets, but inside the small house, the storm had shifted. Ethan wasn't running anymore. The first light of dawn broke faintly across the frozen horizon, casting Duluth beneath a veil of pale gray mist as the last traces of the blizzard melted into silence. Inside Ethan Walker's small house, the heater hummed softly, filling the dim room with a fragile warmth. Lila sat curled on the couch, Noah asleep against her chest, while Shadow rested at her feet, his thick black and tan fur rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Ethan stood by the window, green-gray eyes fixed on the distance where the hidden facility lay beneath the white drifts of snow. This was no longer about choices. It was about survival. Grace Miller arrived just after sunrise, her long beige coat dusted with frost, hazel eyes sharpened with determination as she stepped inside. She was calm, controlled as always, but the tension in her face betrayed the weight of what they were about to attempt. She spread a set of printed blueprints across the table, showing the underground compound where Harper was being held. "Security's tight," she said softly, brushing a strand of loose brown hair from her cheek. "But the facility's vulnerable along the west corridor. They won't expect anyone to come in through the frozen service tunnels. Not in this weather." Ethan leaned over the papers, his jaw tightening beneath his salt and pepper beard, tracing the entry points with his finger. "And once we're inside?" Grace hesitated briefly before replying. "Local police will be in position outside, but they won't enter without proof. We have one shot to get Harper out." Shadow shifted nearby, ears pricked forward, tail flicking lightly against the hardwood floor, as if sensing the urgency humming through the room. Ethan crouched, brushing his hand through the shepherd's thick fur, whispering softly, "Stay close, buddy. I need you on this one." By late afternoon, the snow had thinned to light flurries, and the small convoy began its quiet approach. Ethan drove his battered pickup through the winding back roads that led toward the frozen edge of Lake Superior, Grace riding shotgun with a police scanner balanced on her knees, Shadow seated behind them, his amber eyes focused, muscles tense beneath his coat. Lila and Noah were left under safe watch with a trusted officer, though Lila's tearful pleas had nearly broken Ethan's resolve. "Bring Mama home," she whispered, clutching Shadow's collar before they left. Ethan promised her he would. The compound appeared suddenly from behind a line of pine trees, a squat concrete structure half buried beneath layers of snow, its exterior lit only by a pair of dim security lights flickering against the wind. Two unmarked vans were parked near the gate, their tires half frozen in the icy gravel. Ethan cut the engine, letting silence swallow the truck as his breath misted faintly in the frigid air. Grace handed him an earpiece, her voice low. "Once you're inside, keep moving west until you hit the sub-level corridors. Harper's file mentioned Lab 17. That's where they're keeping her." Ethan nodded, tucking the small pistol into the holster beneath his jacket and sliding the ID badge recovered from the intruder into his pocket. "Stay on the comms," he murmured, his voice steady, controlled. The voice of a soldier stepping back into a war he thought he had left behind. Shadow padded silently at his side as they approached the facility's rear entrance, where the service tunnels dipped beneath layers of ice-packed snow. Ethan knelt briefly, running a gloved hand along the frozen metal grate before sliding the ID card into the reader. A faint click, a whir of gears, and the lock released. He drew a slow breath, his muscles coiled, and stepped into the dark. The tunnel stretched narrow and cold, its concrete walls lined with frost and thin pipes humming faintly overhead. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old machinery and stale water. Shadow's paws were silent against the damp floor, his ears swiveling to every distant sound, tail lowered and rigid as they moved deeper beneath the earth. At the end of the corridor, faint voices carried from beyond a closed steel door. Ethan crouched low, his hand resting on Shadow's collar, feeling the dog's muscles vibrating beneath his palm. He waited, counting the seconds between footsteps, then struck. In one fluid motion, he shoved the door open and slid into the room, his pistol raised. Two guards turned sharply, one reaching for his weapon, but Shadow launched forward, colliding with the man's chest in a burst of muscle and fur. The second guard swung wildly, but Ethan's knee connected sharply with his ribs, sending him sprawling to the concrete floor. Shadow held the first man pinned, snarling low, while Ethan disarmed the other and bound their wrists with a length of paracord he carried from his jacket. Beyond the small lab, a reinforced door waited, marked with faded lettering, "Restricted Lab 17." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he swiped the ID badge again, the lock releasing with a sharp beep. Inside, the lights were dim, casting long shadows across the sterile room. In the corner, strapped to a metal chair with the restraints cutting into her wrists, sat Harper. Her auburn hair was tangled and damp, her pale face hollow beneath exhaustion, but her green eyes widened instantly when they landed on him. "Ethan!" Her voice cracked with disbelief, tears pooling instantly. Shadow darted forward, his nose pressing against Harper's leg, tail wagging softly as a low whimper escaped him. Ethan crouched in front of her, pulling a small knife from his boot and cutting the restraints away. Harper collapsed forward, her trembling hands clutching his shoulders. "You're safe now," he said softly, steadying her against his chest. "We're getting you out." Grace's voice crackled faintly through the earpiece. "You've got company heading your way, Ethan. 2 minutes, maybe less." He stood quickly, supporting Harper with one arm, pistol ready in the other. Shadow trotted ahead, ears forward, hackles raised. They moved fast, retracing their steps through the dim corridor as footsteps thundered faintly behind them. Ethan's breath came rough and sharp, his boots sliding slightly against the icy concrete floor. But he didn't slow. The shepherd growled low, guiding them toward the tunnel as the first shouts echoed closer. The moment they burst out into the freezing night, Grace and 2 officers were waiting with weapons drawn, covering their retreat. Snow flurried wildly around them, wind howling, but Ethan didn't stop until Harper was safely in the truck, Shadow leaping in after her. Behind them, flashing lights cut across the compound's walls as officers secured the rear entrance, forcing Whitmore's men back inside. By the time they reached the edge of town, the storm had broken into a calm, pale dawn. Back at Ethan's house, the warmth of the small living room wrapped around them like a blanket. Lila bolted forward the moment she saw Harper, dropping Noah's blanket as she collided into her mother's arms, sobbing hard into her chest. Harper clutched her daughter close, pressing frantic kisses against her tangled hair, tears streaming freely down her pale cheeks. Shadow circled them, his tail sweeping the hardwood floor as he whined softly, finally relaxing now that the family was whole again. Ethan stood nearby, watching quietly as the fragile reunion unfolded in front of him, the weight of the past few days pressing against his shoulders. Harper turned to him at last, her green eyes glassy but steady. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You saved us, Ethan." He shook his head slowly, his rough voice quiet but firm. "We saved each other." Later, as the morning sun pierced through the thinning clouds, Ethan stepped onto the porch, Shadow sitting proudly at his side. Harper stood with Lila in one arm and Noah resting peacefully in the other, her auburn hair catching the soft light. Together, they watched the first sunlight scatter across the melting snow, the quiet of Duluth wrapped around them like a promise. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something bloom quietly in his chest. Purpose. Not as a soldier, not as a man haunted by loss, but as someone with a family again. The storm had passed, a new dawn had begun. Sometimes, life puts us through storms we never imagined, nights of fear, loss, and heartbreak. But even in the darkest winters, God works in ways we cannot see. Ethan thought he had lost everything, his family, his purpose, his faith. But on those frozen railroad tracks, when a tiny 5-year-old girl whispered for help, God sent Shadow to find her. He led Ethan not only to save 2 fragile lives, but to find his own second chance. This is more than a story of survival. It's a story of faith, redemption, and miracles. Because sometimes, when the world feels cold and silent, God whispers hope into the hearts of ordinary people and turns strangers into family. If you believe God guided Ethan, Shadow, and Harper to this moment, comment Amen below. Share this story to remind someone that miracles still happen. Tell us where you're watching from. Let's see how far this message of hope can reach. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of faith, family, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. Tonight, as you hold your loved ones close, remember, no child is ever truly lost. No prayer goes unheard. And God's grace always finds a way.